So in this series of lectures, we're going to talk about the stories in Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. And this is a collection of stories about the Vietnam War. So they're all sort of short stories collected together in this collection. We're going to talk about, selected ones in there. But if you have time, I would say read the whole book. If you don't have time, we'll be talking about specific stories, and then you can sort of select those ones and read those ones. But I definitely encourage you to read as much as you can from this book. It's one of my favorite texts that we're studying this term. And I think out of all the books that we're reading, this one definitely captures something about war that strikes very sort of real. Um, and, Tim O'Brien is a Vietnam War veteran, and he writes in a way that sort of immerses you in the horrifying conditions of what it would actually be like to be a soldier in the jungles of Vietnam, surrounded by warfare and just in constant fear for one's life. So he really touches on just the horror and fear that the soldiers themselves felt. And he also conveys a kind of ambiguity, the feeling, the sort of moral gray area that the soldiers themselves sort of felt being in this situation. We'll talk a little bit more about Tim O'Brien himself, but he was conscripted into the army. It wasn't his choice, so he didn't volunteer. He was enlisted, selected through the draft. So you can sort of imagine yourself placed in his position. Very little choice in the matter. He had to serve for his country. And so we'll talk about the stories in The Things They Carried, and we'll touch on some common themes throughout all of the stories. So let's start with the author's profile. So a little bit of background information about Tim O'Brien. He was born in 1946 in a small town in Minnesota. And he graduated in 1968 with a BA in political science, and then he was given a draft notice. So if you were given a draft notice, this is the act of conscription, right? So if you were drafted, you had to serve for the military without, you couldn't object to your draft notice. You would be viewed as a coward, or you would be skipping out on the draft. You'd have to leave the country. So he was drafted into the military, even though he was against the war. So the Vietnam War was very controversial, and many Americans opposed the US involvement in the Vietnam War. And O'Brien also did not believe in or that the war was justified, uh, but he still was drafted, so he had to serve. So he served in the military from 1969 to 1970 as an infantry foot soldier. And then after his return, he went on to school, to graduate school in Harvard, where he took journalism. And then eventually he became a newspaper reporter and started publishing his memoirs, where he talked about his military service. And he insists that his writing is fiction. He's saying, he'll say, this is not autobiography, this is fiction. However, he has a way of sort of blurring the lines between fiction and reality. And I think he does this sort of consciously to convey how we tell stories. All past, all history is sort of known to us through our storytelling. So in some ways, truth is fiction, right? Because we all have this sort of subjective way of viewing what has happened. We all have a different way of remembering things. So, even myself, the way that I would, if you asked me what I did this weekend, I might have a different perspective on what I did than my boyfriend would. So we would have a different story or different take on what happened last weekend. So you can think about history or truth as somewhat fictionalized. And in the short story, How to Tell a True War Story, uh, Tim O'Brien he'll sort of discuss this sort of blurring of the lines between what is truth, right, and what is fiction. So the element of storytelling will be very sort of prominent in Tim O'Brien's writing. And the quote there at the bottom, this would be his quote discussing his dilemma in serving his country. So he says, my conscience kept telling me not to go, but my whole upbringing told me I had to. That horrible summer made me a writer. So that detailed story appears in the book. So the one called On the Rainy River kind of deals with his own feelings, the dilemma that he faced in following the draft notice and enlisting, or skipping the draft and going to Canada where he could avoid serving in the military. So he was like a lot of Americans who opposed the war. They didn't believe that it was a justified invasion of the American involvement in Vietnam. So you can put yourself in the late 1960s. You might think of, hippies or protesting or civil rights or all these sort of culturally important counter movements, countercultures that were going on, and war protests were a part of that. So they were protesting the American involvement in Vietnam. So there was a lot of opposition to the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and we'll talk a little bit about the Vietnam War, just for background's sake, give you a little bit more context. But you might want to do some of your own reading about Vietnam if it is something that you haven't thought about before. So let's talk a little bit about some background information about the American and Vietnam War. So the first point is that America felt Vietnam was a threat to the spread of communism. So at this time, this was sort of part of the Cold War between America and communist countries, Russia, China, etc. But the Americans felt that there was a threat of that one country, there would be a domino effect where one country would fall to communism and then another and another would fall and communism would spread that way. So they feared the spread of communism in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, we have the leader Ho Chi Minh and the communists who were wanting to create a unified Vietnam and declare it as an independent country. So their intention was to separate Vietnam from its colonial the history of their colonial occupants. So that France invaded Vietnam and it was a French colony. So Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Viet Cong, the communists of the northern part of Vietnam, wanted all of Vietnam to be unified and to be an independent, autonomous country. So many felt that Americans' involvement in the feud between South and North Vietnam was, not justified, and they were getting involved in a civil war situation and had no part in it. So this did not stop the Americans from getting involved. So they it reached its peak, so they brought in their troops. And so from 1965 to 1969, there was a maximum of 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. So the American troops were fighting alongside the South Vietnam against the North of Vietnam. The enemy they felt were the Viet Cong, is what they called them, led by Ho Chi Minh. And in order to get men into the military service, they used a draft, or what we call conscription. So you could be notified by mail that you were being called or selected for military service. So it wasn't voluntary. You didn't go on your own volition to sign up for the military. You were drafted. So you were selected, and as long as you were sort of young and healthy and had no sort of religious conflict with your military participation, then you would have to serve in the military. There were sort of conscientious objectors, people who did not believe in the war. Some people skipped their draft and fled to another country, Canada being the closest country where many drafted soldiers fled to and avoided the service. However, if you did that, you would also face, a lot of judgment by your country, right? So it would be a source of shame, humiliation. You could be viewed as a coward or traitor. So there were consequences to either your decision. And we have men being sent over to fight in the war. And they were, trained with basic training, and these were sort of conventional warfare techniques, strategies. However, the Viet Cong used different tactics. So they were using guerrilla warfare, and the American troops were trained in sort of conventional, basic training. So this caused many deaths. So by guerrilla tactics, I'm trying to sort of say that the Viet Cong were often they couldn't be easily differentiated from a civilian, so they didn't have a sort of standard uniform. They navigated through the jungles more easily, so there wasn't a conventional battlefield. They would sort of attack and then move away, so they weren't part of this sort of trench warfare or anything that we saw earlier in the first two world wars. And for the American troops, it was just very difficult for them to identify who was the enemy. So this resulted in a lot of innocent people losing their lives on both sides. So the Viet Cong, they weren't using tanks or any sort of heavy artillery. They often moved by foot through the jungles, and